So much has been said about lenses and landscape photography in general. You can see so many videos on YouTube, so many articles online, and have also written a few. But on this video, let's do a real talk. Let's not talk about just the best lenses for landscape photography. Let's talk about the choices that you have and basically which scenarios is best for which lens. Generally, let's talk about what works. Enough about the best lenses for landscape photography. I mean, that standard changes every 6 months or every year depending on what system you're using. Let's talk about the reality of lenses. Let this be a guide for beginners as well as maybe a refresher or an awakening for some more advanced users. Lenses are very important. In fact, some people would argue that it's more important to invest on better glass than to keep upgrading camera bodies. But of course, there are so many different factors to play around in that. But let's talk about lenses for landscape photography. What are the important points and what works? Point number one is that, of course, you can shoot landscapes with any lens. There will also, of course, be some limitations with one lens over another, but generally, if you are creative enough, you can shoot landscapes with any lens that you have. Next, of course, is the guiding principle that, of course, we would want as sharp a lens as possible, but maybe not always talking about the sharpest. Of course, something important also is range, which is actually the key factor when it comes to landscape photography. And of course, last is the size of the lens. First, let's talk about standard zoom lenses. For those people who use full frame, this is the usual 24 to 70, 28 to 75, 28 to 60 for the A7C kit. And that brings up quite an interesting thing about kit lenses, because actually kit lenses are standard zoom lenses. For APS-C users, we're talking about the 16 to 50 or 18 to 55, depending on what system you're using. But if I were to make a recommendation to someone who's buying their first gear and is choosing to try landscape photography, I would still recommend to get the kit lens. Or if you have a bit more budget, of course, get the more premium standard zooms. So, for example, if you're a Sony user, you want to get the A7C, get it with the 28 to 60. If you have more budget, then of course, you can go to the 2470 G Master or the 24105. This is my main recommendation because perhaps this is the most versatile lens. The most important factor here is range. 24 millimeters is wide and 70 millimeters is kind of the tail end of telephoto. And so this gives you a lot of versatility. That's precisely the reason why most cameras have kit lenses that are standard zooms, because it wants to give you the ability to shoot a bit wide but also to shoot a bit telephoto. And for me, still the most useful lens for landscape photography is a standard zoom because of that fact. In fact, a standard zoom lens is probably the lens I would never leave home without, because even if I'm faced with a wide vista, I can shoot at 24. If I need a bit wider, I can always shoot panoramas. And if I need to shoot something quite distant, 70 millimeters is not that bad in terms of range. So if you were to have just one lens for landscape photography, I would still say get a good standard zoom. Now let's talk about variants. Of course, not all standard zoom lenses are the f2.8 versions. For the first 2 years that I was using Sony, I was using the 24 to 70 f4, and I really found no limitation with it in terms of landscape photography. Of course, that is a Zeiss lens. Now let's go into ultra-wide angle lenses. For most people, they would say that the bread and butter of a landscape photographer is an ultra-wide angle. Here I have the 16 to 35 f2.8 G Master, and this is perhaps the benchmark for Sony landscape photographers. Basically, what we're after with ultra wide angle lenses is to be able to shoot wider vistas and also include a bit of foreground elements. Having really nice composition with very nice foreground elements that kind of lead your viewer's eyes towards the main view is something that is quite abused or maybe overused with landscape photography. But the reason behind that is that it works. Shooting with ultra wide angle lenses makes that happen. So, of course, ultra wide angle lenses come as 16 to 35. Some brands have it at 17 to 35, 17 to 40. Some also have 17 to 28. For Sony, it's mainly 16 to 35, f2.8 or f4, which is the Sony Zeiss version, plus also the addition of the Sony 12 to 24, which comes at 2.8 and 4. And yeah, those lenses, those ranges actually work the best for wider vistas. And it's always nice to have an ultra wide angle. So if I were to build a kit, of course, I would never leave without an ultra wide angle and a standard zoom. Now, of course, to complete the trinity, let's talk about telephoto lenses. No, I'm not just talking about 70 to 200 millimeter lenses. In fact, if I had a bit more budget, I wouldn't be using a 70 to 200. Hear me out on this one. Of course, telephoto lenses, lenses that go beyond 70 millimeters, usually going at the very least to 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, all that. These give us the ability to zoom in on distant vistas, distant views. And these also give us the ability to zoom in on intimate landscapes, as some would call it, which is basically a very isolated composition of nice views in the outdoors. And this allows us to shoot and isolate certain patterns. And quite frankly, if I were to choose one shooting scenario as my favorite, it would have to be shooting with a telephoto with a very wide vista and being able to zoom in and isolate on some patterns. I have a few favorites taken from some locations here in the Philippines. And really, I love that because I think this is the most high yield shooting scenario. And so that's why having a good telephoto is important for landscape photography. Now let's go into the real talk. Right now I'm using, and I currently own, the 70 to 200 f4. I am not using the G Master equivalent, which is the f2.8, for two obvious reasons. Number one, it's more expensive than this, and number two, it's much heavier than this. Now, of course, Sony just released the 70 to 200 f2.8 G Master version 2. And I haven't gotten a chance to try it out, but that lens is 30% lighter than the first version of the 2.8 G Master. And so I might actually consider that given the change in the weight. However, if weight and cost were not a factor, I would actually probably be shooting either with the 200 to 600 millimeter or the 100 to 400 millimeter G Master. Because if I am going to bring three lenses, it would be an ultra wide, a standard zoom, and probably the longest telephoto zoom lens that I could bring. Now, lastly, let's talk about primes. Of course, there are many different prime lenses. There are some telephoto primes, some standard zoom or normal range primes. This, in fact, is a 50 millimeter, which is one of only two prime lenses that I own, because I use this for product photos and I use the 35 for videos, which you are seeing now. And generally, personally, I don't shoot with primes in landscape photography that often, but it is possible, of course. As I always say, you can shoot landscapes with any lens. It's just that there are some benefits or some advantages with having different ranges. And given that prime lenses come in different ranges, they are, of course, quite useful. It's just a matter of really matching the right prime for the right location. For example, if you have, say, the 14mm prime from Sony, or maybe the 24mm prime, they are, of course, very usable with landscape photography. It's just that, of course, if the scene indicates a bit more zooming in, maybe it would have been better with the 2470 or the 7200. Or if you're shooting with a prime, you could go with a 50 or an 85 or a 135. The limitations are what you have to work with when you're shooting with primes. And really, again, it's matching the right prime for the right location. For example, if you're shooting some hills and you want to isolate, maybe then the best prime for you would be a 135, which isn't quite something a lot of landscape photographers would usually get. But perhaps the favorite primes for landscape photographers, as I said, are either the 14mm f1.8, and I'm talking about the Sony ecosystem, but you can look up some equivalents for other camera brands. So it's the 14mm f1.8, which is fairly new, and the 24mm f1.4 G Master. Of course, these are wide lenses with really big apertures, so they are also quite beneficial. Not just quite beneficial, they are really beneficial for shooting some nighttime landscape photography with the night sky. Perhaps another option I can tell you is the 20mm f1.8 for the same exact reason. And when it comes to costs, I think out of the three I mentioned, that is the most cost-effective one. And yeah, so prime lenses for landscape photography, not quite the ideal. Of course, if you have a lot of choices, then maybe, yes, you should get a prime. In general, I would again stick to a 1635, 24-70, and a 70-100, or a 100-400. F4 is sometimes almost as good as the f2.8, especially when you factor in the weight and the cost. But of course, if you have unlimited budget and maybe you don't mind carrying a bit more weight, then you can, of course, go all to f2.8. But generally, perhaps this is also kind of my what's in your bag video that I don't think I would ever do. But yeah, 1635, 24-70. Another good choice is the 24-105 f4, and 70-200 or 100-400 millimeter. So again, if you would ask me, it's not just about having the best lens for landscape photography, but actually the best lens for the kind of shot that you are going to do. And of course, having more options will give you more flexibility. And that is why mainly I use zoom lenses. If you were to just pick one to get at f2.8, I would take the wide one. If I were to get a prime, I would get a wide angle prime, a 24, 14, or 20 millimeter with a really wide aperture. There we go. If you have any questions about these lenses, if you need some more recommendations, feel free to leave them down below in the comments. And if you haven't, don't forget to subscribe to my humble little channel. Thank you.